Thanks a lot, especially to Katja, Antonia, Diana, and Barbara. You see, I have also my difficulties. Yeah, I feel in many respects very humble to be here. I think I'd know that I don't know that kind of increases now every day. I also don't want to present, let's say, one single research area. That would be, in my case, especially fluxus and curatorial practice. I divided the presentation in two parts. On the one side, I would like to show you in what way archival practices, writing, printed matters, the web journal as an online resource and accessible platform, and discursive events are interrelated, and that these formats are all driven by some wish, production, or thrive, or urgency, or lack. After this part, I would like to theorize these relations. In 1998, we held a conference in North Germany on critical and socially engaged curatorial practices. As another form to interrogate that area, we, in that case Barnaby Drabble and I, developed 5 years later a traveling archive, ironically or half ironically called Curating Degree Zero Archive, which made it possible to discuss with local and international communities about critical curating, or curating critique, as one of our later publications was titled. It actually went to 18 different venues, mostly all over Europe, and I have chosen 3 kind of show very briefly, and that one was in the space Katja has curated at that time, the Centre d'Art Contemporain. And I would like to remind you on the notion of mal d'archive by Derrida, which means on the same time the longing for an archive against amnesia and also the evil of the archive, its reduction and its rigidity. Curating Degree Zero Archive was reinterpreted at each venue, art institution or art academy, and new positions were added with the hosts. So it became a living archive, and what was, for me at least, the most important thing, it became a possibility to discuss art and critical curating with a specific and engaged public in a specific context and within the political issues of that historical moment. It traveled around Europe to 18 venues. I only quickly will show 3 of them, and ended with material and ephemera contributed by 100 curators, artist curators, and curatorial groups. It is now part of the library of the university in Zurich, Switzerland for future research, because at one point we wanted to stop the process and to follow the urgency behind it with other means. Very quickly, kind of how it was put on view on different venues. Here it's Lüneburg, Halle für Kunst, and also we had invited artists to make kind of inserts or to work with the archive. Okay, and also we worked sometimes with students as mediators for the archive. Okay, that's Berlin. And again, it was very important for us that there were kind of local groups who then, who then worked with the archive and tried to kind of get their own hold and grip, and also their own discursive modalities, speaking and working with the archive. So the next step, in 2008, I developed with students of the Postgraduate Programme in Curating the web platform OnCurating.org to open up the discussion profoundly and internationally. We invite editors to explore specific topics, sometimes on a rather theoretical level, sometimes more based on interviews with curators, artists, and theoreticians. And it is possible, by the way, to hand in proposals in the realm of a critical curatorial perspective and cultural analysis. I would like to give you these examples, because it's on the one hand, it's an online resource, on the other hand, it's also possible to get it as these kind of magazines. We need them back later on because you can get access anyway. From the very beginning, it did interest us to develop not just publications, but also conferences and workshops with, for example, the Friedrichianum in Kassel and the Mikromuseum for Gegenwartskunst in Zurich and other spaces. For us, it is interesting to see how this platform is expanding and developing. We see from the downloads and subscriptions that the issues are spread literally worldwide in about 90 different countries, and they often function as reading material for curatorial classes. Especially because of this visibility, we would like to share the platform even more. So that was conference and then again a publication, so it also tried to kind of interrelate these different formats. But I'm also interested in the relation of the digital space to an architectural and institutional space, and also specific local situations, and we wanted to explore this furthermore with other means to be a little bit more experimental as well with the journal. So to come quickly to a sort of projects we did also realize with the OnCurating journal, trying to expand the visual side and of the whole endeavor. For example, we created one issue that consists of editions from artists. The project was called Editions Ready to Print, and it was also developed with students of the Curating Programme. Ready to Print was a project conceived as a feedback format, a crossover between contemporary art, media, and design. We asked 13 artists with different backgrounds and formal interests to produce PDF editions. Each of them produced a work consisting of 16 A4 pages of paper, which in most cases were assembled to form a single two-dimensional work in A0 format. These contemporary editions are downloadable as PDFs from the web journal issue 10. The editions are available to everyone in the world who has a computer, printer, and a tape at his or her own disposal. The artists were chosen by a relatively large group of young curators who, in the selection processes, were guided by various concerns. We had been very interested in the works of these artists also for a longer time. This is, for example, Benny Bischoff, the work by Benny Bischoff, that is Birgit Brenner, that is Danny Gahl, Lucy Kolb, the Guerrilla Girls, who kind of provided an older work, Daniel Knorr, Monochrome, Felipe Mujica, Rika Taurianen, and Shirana Shabatzi. Several of them worked with paper in special ways, whether exploring its haptic, sculptural, or demonstrative political qualities. So we kind of had different entry points for the public to print out the material. For example, this was the Zurich-based White Space. And so that was kind of an event always to print it out, to glue it together, and then also kind of discuss about things. Many of these artists we invited live in Western Europe metropolises, but come from very different cultural backgrounds. As a multicultural group of organizers, we ourselves also had the feeling of being in a kind of transfer zone. In this context, the term transfer refers to nomadic living conditions in post-Fordist societies. The living conditions of migrants, expats, commuters, artists, and scholars. A large number of different subjects within this zone leads to a kind of provisional life. Its neoliberal description as bearable, or better still as desirable, bears reference to traditional stable models of society and implies a loss. Is there a thing as a radicalness of provisionality, or would such radicalness prevent the solidarization of persons in precarious employment circumstances and make those temporary situations easier to exploit? In the world of art and scholarship, on the other hand, there are frequent situations in which the protagonists cite Deleuze and Guattari in the endeavor to legitimize their own mobility. A number of questions we asked ourselves can surely not be answered by an artistic project, but only through conflictual political processes. These questions nevertheless form the project's background. We asked ourselves how the state of professionality is mirrored in the pictorial media and architectures of the everyday cultures. What role do urban architectures play? Where do they function as dehistorizing authoritarian structures? Where do they provide globally recognizable containers for roving subjects? How do they permit other subversive possibilities? How do subjects create niches and identifications in these environments dominated by the flow of money? So that was the slide before was in Berlin, that was in Stuttgart. And we had also one event in Tel Aviv and one in Ljubljana. So, and then we also asked the public to send back what they have in a way curated. And that are just some of the images we got then sent back. That's from Austria. It's near a big museum. A lot of them were actually sent back from private homes, which was also coming as an astonishment for us. That was probably sent back from Finland according to the ending of the email. Sent back from Switzerland. Yeah, and then also one could see that the people who kind of dealt with the issues started to work with them in a very free way. Sent back from Tel Aviv, as well from Tel Aviv, and again from Berlin. Find its way anywhere, to be whirled through the air in Chicago, hidden in a drawer in London's financial district, on a tree trunk or a street billboard, on windshields carried as a banner in a demonstration, or passed on subversively from one person to the next. We wanted to put the public in the, let's say, imaginary or imagined position of the curator from the start. It was the unknown guest or user who, having downloaded the editions, decided on its or their assembly and presentation. Yet we also wanted to be involved ourselves and therefore asked that the interventions or presentations be photographed and returned to us. Surprisingly for us, but perhaps also characteristic of the neoliberal power structures in Western Europe countries, the artist hardly proposed any slogans or other more political statements as editions. Perhaps that was the reason why the editions were installed far more frequently in private settings than in the public space. In the photos we received, the private thus also transformed into something exhibited, another situation we hadn't entirely anticipated. And a second project, oh yes, and also we had, for example, then invited the Guerrilla Girls, because I also think that's an important reference point for young scholars. Another project we have done now very recently is, I think the magazine is now circulating. It's in the framework of an exhibition at the Kunsthalle Zurich. They printed it. It was based on two collections, one by Daniel Baumann and the other by a collector of ephemera, Christoph Schifferli. And the framework was also a symposium with these people. So on the one hand, you see here also the possibility to print out the whole issue, and at the Kunsthalle Zurich, and also the symposium was held there, and then we invited young artists from more or less, because I also worked with the students on that project, and the students are coming from very different backgrounds, so we also encouraged them to work with people, the artists they know from their home countries, and so we asked the young we asked the artists all to do a new kind of artistic self-advertisement and to create a new ephemera for this issue. As I said, you could print them out there and then, kind of be, that's maybe also inspired by Fluxus to make art really accessible in a way that everybody could download these artistic practices. Okay, here's again the newest the newest issues. I think some of them are circling at the moment. Each of the projects had many different aspects one could explore, but today I would like to take up one specifically, which is actually inspired by many of your amazing talks these days, who developed an interesting approach of what constitutes memory, of what constitutes urgency and longing, and of what constitutes writing about art. From my perspective, this would mean always historize, always contextualize, and always localize, as Helmut Draxler has put it in a rereading of the collection of Generali Foundation in Vienna. Let me quickly, and I guess unduly condensed, describe which thoughts resonated within me in the last days. First of all, in writing about an unseen exhibition, Philippa pointed out a problem we all, especially researchers and writers on complex art pieces, have nowadays. At least, let me tell you, I, as a Fluxus researcher, had that problem. The projects, the events, the actual encounters are long gone. Some relics might exist, some photography might exist, artist descriptions do exist, many different ones to be precise. Some ephemera do exist, posters, invitation cards, and a variety of leftovers or scores or weird musical instruments do exist, and so on. So I might ask you, and what is it that is called Fluxus? I would like to argue that it is certainly not a specific object or project. It is exactly the whole discourse existing in a variety of written, spoken, photographical, object-based media and their institutionalized relations. The whole media complex creates what Roland Barthes had described in Mus today. The sign systems are connected. They create meaning through their special constellation. This meaning production is never objective or transhistorical. It operates in a historical moment and surrounding in a very specific way. And again, this meaning production is for sure connected to the context it is put into. A smashed piano would mean something else in 1962 in Germany as in, let's say, 2016 in Germany at the same place. Any historical and political issue would change the meaning of an artwork or an exhibition. The exhibition and the artwork consists of the materiality and of what is considered to be true or false, right or wrong, good art or bad art. It is constituted and consecrated through discourse. It can be understood with what Foucault called a discursive formation, with its material, verbal trajectories and its institutions. This discursive formation we could call art has its very real effects. From a historical position, we can just trace and guess what it might feel like to have an encounter somewhere else and at another time. This must be explored and enfolded. For example, what does it mean to read Indian modernity through a tantric tradition, as Shukla kind of proposed yesterday in the bus? What means an actual encounter in the here and now, anyway? So to deal also with Fluxus, we then kind of created a film, which is also kind of very much informed on a very art historical basis, I would say. Is it now? Is a consistent and ongoing question. Is it now what we experience here and now? Together, I remember the famous image Freud developed for the cultural and social traces which are inscribed into our minds subconsciously. He proposed to think of a Wunderblock, paper and a wax layer, which can be rewritten again and again, but it keeps traces of former inscriptions, and these traces are part of what we encounter in the now. Is it now? This contains a whole bundle of layers of assumptions on gender, on truth, society, and so on. This is an even more urgent question in the digital age, where the boundaries between original and copy are non-existing on the one hand, and on the other, the constant overflow with not necessarily critical images creates mondial or worldwide traces in our minds and changes our perceptions. Distances are collapsing. We meet these days in Dhaka and in March in Hong Kong, in June in Basel. In between we exchange emails or Skype. The North Sea might be at our doorsteps, as Peter Weibel put it. Through the digital, which actually everything is now processed, all transmitted interpellations are streamlining us, our minds, our thinking, and our idea of ourselves, of gender, of communities. At the same time, the digital space offers platforms for an extreme variety of views and images, and has in that respect not only the possibility for extreme segregation, but also for new public spaces and processes. But before we go lost in cyberspace, let's go back to the complex art. Being interested in living archives, we changed the media in this case of exploring fluxes. Ronald Kolb and I worked on a film in 11 chapters. What is fluxes? Who was fluxes? Politics and fluxes, gender and fluxes, gentrification and fluxes, and so on. So the argumentation changed into film format to show the multiplicity of voices, opinions, and practices, to open up again this restricted outlook on fluxes, reduced to some protagonists. We wanted to show the contradictions, problems, fights, the engagement, and the decisions. But let's get back to art and critical writing about art, which could maybe happen in digital space, but should be played back to discuss it locally. Art is produced in a complex way through consecration processes, through institutions such as Kunsthallen, venues for contemporary art, art academies, art critique, through verbal and visual discourses and artifacts. It is for sure no longer anything as such, and never was, by the way, and the thing has no agency of its own. Here is the actor network theory by Bruno Latour dramatically misleading. A thing has agency, but just as a sign, in the above-mentioned constellation, which produces meaning. Any sign, as you might remember, is constructed through visual and acoustic interrelation, which forms an entity. You cannot think arbre, or tree, or baum without projecting an image. A sign will produce meaning in a context, which means in a historical, cultural, and social constellation. I therefore would also reject the embedded notion of a communality of matter and human entities developed by Jean-Luc Nancy, especially since we had the opportunity to ask him about the power relations in this notion of being with. He's just not so interested in this part, he told us. Anyway, to conceive art as a discursive formation as developed above, I deeply disagree with Daniel Baumann on that issue, as you see in this announcement at the beginning of the curated show here. And I refer to the text that is shown at the beginning of the show, where he kind of rejects post-colonial theory and so on, whatever. I think that art is a discourse, material, ideological, institutionalized, verbalized, disputable, and one does not alter this in ignoring it. There is no outside of the discourse, as Derrida has once put it, so overwhelmingly precise. The only outcome of ignoring the discursive production of an artwork and of exhibitions means that one has not the access to a broader understanding of what one is doing, being an artist or a curator or an author, a filmmaker or an art critic, and perhaps one just tries to ignore the persistent what, why, and for whom questions. Just to say so much, there is also no outside of capitalism at the moment. A conclusion of my above formulated assumptions would be that art critique is part of reformulating, of rereading, of reinterpreting an artwork. It changes understanding and meaning. It is part of constituting an artwork, together with institutional settings. I would totally agree that there can be something hidden in an artwork that hits you, that strikes and penetrates, that blows your mind, something that shakes your understanding of your own subjectivity. This moment of destabilization, which is beyond the aesthetic, which was described so artfully by my younger colleagues these days, is the quality of being untamed, of disturbing institutions and conventions, with art, with writing. This is something beyond the register of the symbolic, to use Lacan's notion. It is the touch of the real, but only if it again plays back into the symbolic register, then it can become political. It can be known that pollution is due to structural powers, when it is possible to join forces with political agendas, when we form chains of equivalence with other societal groups. So, for me, it is essential to come back again and again in an urge of repetition to discuss these issues within temporary and local groups and on international platforms, to play back what is now, what is the political and social, which interpellation an artwork or an exhibition produces, which effects might it produce, what means criticality in the given moment. And to learn something from a place, be that learning from Warsaw, or learning from Athens, or learning from Dhaka, it means one has to learn about the way the money goes, what this means for art and art production, which layers of culture exist, and what could be a critical cultural production. It would mean to be curious about what is happening and in what way the local production of goods and commodities of all sorts are related to the international markets. In what way is cultural production understood in a context? Is art or cultural production just a commodity, or does it open up new ways of living, of thinking, of being a subject, or defining communities? Which power structure does art production help to establish or de-establish, and which parts of society are uncovered? Which transactions and flows of money, which power relations? Learning from Dhaka means to discuss hegemonal takeovers in art and culture. It means to discuss where Dhaka Swiss design comes from, H&M clothes, and who wears them. Culture is something that happens alongside infrastructure and monetary flows. I would like to close with a quotation by Gayatri Chakravorty-Spivak. What people call transculture is culture as it happens. Culture alive is its own counterexample. Transculturation is not something special and different. It is a moment in a taxonomy of the normality of what is called culture. To assign oneself the special task of cultural translation or blotting cultural translation has therefore to be put within a political context. Thanks.
On your proposition of learning from Dhaka and your comment about culture happening alongside infrastructure and monetary flows, how do you think, for example, we could consider the word, the text, writing critically, to be navigating and contributing with some sort of mindfulness in the creation of meaning, whether it's exhibition or artwork, within this frame where we are now, within this public space in which we are now in the Dhaka Art Summit? And here I want to raise one element of your text where you talk about the radicalness of provisionality as a potential path to follow, and also the living quality of many of your practices.
The panel, I have unfortunately not seen everything of this panel by Hans Ulrich and others. I don't know exactly who was all on that panel, but as I kind of heard it also from others, that a kind of a very post-colonial attitude is kind of very much kind of existing again and again, and I think a little bit it would be time to ask people who are living here and doing research in the area to take over the space of discussion much more. That would be my proposition.
Campaigns for critical writing, and we've had lots of debates, we've run lots of workshops, and we've done bursaries for people to write. And I've also been part of the Critic campaign, which was part of Liverpool John Moores University. So this is a subject which is quite close to my heart because I've been very involved in it as an arts writer myself as well, who writes internationally. And I feel a little bit like we're kind of missing something here about the financing, because for me the financing is really key part of the diversity. And although we can say about the urgency and things like that, I think that sometimes we don't hear a diverse audience because of the funding. And I think that we can carry on, you know, doing these things and creating these platforms, but actually I think that they always end up being quite elitist a little bit, because the people who can afford to do that are the people who maybe already have a job or something like that. And I think that this is my issue with the diversity, is that there's, you know, and I think that it is the main political issue with arts writing as well sometimes, because government funding cuts in the UK have had a lot of influence on that. And then obviously here there isn't much government funding for the arts.
A lot of things we also do as interviews, actually, and sometimes, as you said, but I must say also people sometimes, a lot of people are interested in the topics, also just hand over papers and so on. Sometimes papers that are already published somewhere else, but kind of create another possibility of meaning production in that context. And but on the other hand, it's very clear that the university would fund that much better than that would bound the whole endeavor back to the university hierarchies. So that would be then very clear that specific people had to publish there. Even the design would be nothing that or we could decide on, and so on, so on. So I think actually we are putting, I think, a lot of work in it. But I think it's important to have a little bit of this freedom to move between institutions and founding bodies and so on. I think sometimes you have to do that in that way.
Fascinated by the kind of persona that your course is creating, and somewhat bemused, perplexed, and probably envious that I can't do it. I feel I'm not needed now, because I came into curating out of practice in the art world as an artist, but practice in teaching, and I'm very intrigued, just to be more precise, where do your students come from? What have they done before? Because the image that is, they have these super women and super men, perhaps super men too. But, and what was the other question? Yes, where do you start your history of thought? That's interesting. How do you go about framing the whole business, which I see really in the sense I'm skeptical about because I think it's becoming more and more of a business in the sense of leaving what it used to be.
Yes, I totally agree, and thanks for your comments. My students are actually coming from a lot of different land, and the other half is coming from more or less all over the world. And and I think you made a point. I think it's going to be more and more a business, as also artists partially. And what I really try to kind of make possible is to start to be self-reflective, to go into processes of discussion, of reading theory, you know, in some kind of really old-fashioned, to read things, to discuss them, to interrelate them of what you are living in, to speak about your own living conditions and so on, to speak about the political context of the countries you come from, also to try to learn from each other is kind of a notion I think a conscious notion we have in the program. In galleries there are a lot of people who work actually already in art institutions. Now we have also 2 collectors in the program, so it's really diverse. If you are I have here 2 of these. History of curating. I try to also kind of what I bring with me is as a possibility to engage with this more the history of the aesthetics on the one hand as an ideological history. On the other hand, I would say that curating as such is instituted at the moment when you kind of start to speak about a curator. And I think that the image of Harald Seemann kind of worked like a symbolic moment to institute the profession of curating, for better or worse.